Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 1 Virginia Morris. We warmly welcome the family of Flying Officer Charles Edward Suffren, whose story will be told shortly. Tomorrow marks the commencement of a new sitting year for the 47th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial to reflect on the freedoms afforded to us as Australians, freedoms underpinned by those who serve and those who have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells remind us of what it means to be Australian, committed to one another and to this nation. Here with us this evening are the men and women elected by Australians to make the decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe. The roll of honour cloaking us reminds us of the cost of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served. As the members of the Parliament commence the sitting period, your presence here speaks to every Australian of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and to our country. This evening we're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia, the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 47th Parliament of Australia who are joining us this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge Air Marshal Robert Chipman, representing the Chief of the Defence Force, Major General Greg Mellick, the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, the Honourable Kim Beazley, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial and fellow members of the Memorials Council, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. We also warmly welcome Wing Commander Dr Marianne Whiting, retired, representing the Air Force Association. And as always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome the members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by family and guests of the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I would now like to invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would like to acknowledge David Pearson and Chloe Pearson, the family of Flying Officer Charles Edward Suffren. I also acknowledge the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, and all of my colleagues from across the Parliament. Air Marshal Robert Chipman, representing the Chief of the Defence Force. Major General Greg Mellick, the National President of the RSL. The Honourable Kim Beazley, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Matt Adamson, the Director of the Australian War Memorial. Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, Chief of Navy, Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, Chief of Army, Air Marshal Stephen Chappell, Chief of Air Force. We come together here at the start of each parliamentary year in remembrance and in respect. We come because we share a solemn duty to reflect on our debt to all who have put on the uniform and served in our name, and to all who serve now. It is a debt whose scale is written in the faces of our veterans. It is measured in places made hollow by the bodies of our fallen, from battlefield to seabed. And it is weighed in the stones that stand sentinel over graves in military cemeteries across the world, silent testament to all that we have lost. Some bear names, many do not. Some ache with messages from loved ones, words of parting chiselled in a tombstone they knew they would never see. The power of those messages is untouched by time. From Port Moresby, where the final resting place of Private Bruce Stanton bears the inscription, "Beautiful memories of my only son, so loved, so mourned." To Gallipoli, where Lance Corporal William O'Brien is mourned forever in the devastating simplicity of 5 words. We miss him at home. Then there is the grave of Private Frank Roberts. Private Roberts fought at the Battle of Hamel under Monash, the first time Australian soldiers fought alongside US infantry. He so nearly made it to the Great War's end and the long journey home to his wife that they must have both dreamed of over and over again. Then at Mont Saint-Quentin, scarcely 2 months before the Western Front finally fell silent, Private Roberts was felled by an enemy bullet. Over the coming years, his father would go on to pour his grief into an ever-growing pile of scrapbooks, a towering paper monument to the symmetry of love and grief. Yet the inscription on Private Roberts' gravestone is a reminder of something brighter, his family choosing a line from one of his letters home, a line that would stand as well for him in death as it did in life. It reads, "Not lonely with the boys, I'm one of the Aussie family here. For amid war's bleak rhythm of fear, boredom and horror, there was a camaraderie no enemy could ever crush. So as we gather here, we think of that spirit that has carried every Australian who has answered the call through the decades. We think of every place Australians have stood and every place they have fallen, all of it mapped out in our hearts in an atlas of loss and sacrifice. And we think of the multitudes cast into the ranks of the unknown soldier as they were torn from life. As we vow in the ode of remembrance, we remember them at the going down of the sun. For it is perhaps then, as day yields to night, that we can let ourselves imagine them most clearly, gathering about us at the edge of the light. All those faces, all those voices, every street that once rang with their youth, every household whose collective heart beat louder with their presence, households that grew quieter when war called them away. As the sun's glow fades from the sky, we remember them, not as photographs held distant by dust and sepia, nor as a cenotaph's solemn roll call, and we hold them in our hearts. We remember every time they stood tall against the nightfall of humanity. We remember every hope they carried for a brighter dawn. And as the rays of the sun come to warm us once again, we remember them in the morning, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now invite the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, to the lectern.
Prime Minister, my parliamentary colleagues, Chairman of the Australian War Memorial, Kim Beazley, and Director of the Australian War Memorial, Matt Anderson, the Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Air Marshal Robert Chipman, representing the CDF, Chiefs of Navy, Army and Air Force, and Chiefs of Joint Capabilities and Personnel. All those remarkable men and women serving in uniform here today. RSL National President Greg Mellick, the cherished veterans who are with us this afternoon, and the families of veterans honouring those they cherished, especially the Pearson family. Thank you, David and Chloe, for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, one and all, good afternoon. Let me take you back to the dying days of World War II and tell you about some Australian boys, and boys they were. Lancaster bomber crew. At the controls, we had Robin Ordell. Before the war, Robin had acted on stage and screen and been a radio broadcaster for 2GB. Behind his right shoulder was the navigator Ian Osborne, who was a student prior to enlisting, as was Keith Reynolds, the wireless operator seated next to navigator Ian. The three Sydney-siders were joined by fellow New South Welshman John Killen, a cattle farmer from Tumut. John was used to being on his feet, but he lay prone in the nose of the aircraft as the crew's bomb aimer. With the front of the Lancaster dominated by men from New South Wales, the back of the bomber was all Victorian. In the upper turret was Kevin McCaskill from Morwell. In the rear turret was James Harper. Only a few years earlier, Kevin worked as a grocer in Melbourne while James was an apprentice cabinet maker in Geelong. Manning the guns, the two Victorians had the difficult job of defending the Lancaster bomber from enemy fighters. Completing the crew of 7 was a Brit, Charles Skerr, the flight engineer who sat next to his pilot and Captain Robert. Charles's inclusion in this Australian team made this an allied crew in character and calling. In peacetime, each man was unique, living very different lives. Yet war had thrust them together with a common purpose. Each man performed a critical role, creating a crew greater than the sum of its parts. Their Lancaster was one of many with the Royal Air Force's 100 Squadron within Bomber Command. After more than 5 years of conflict, the Nazi war machine was on the back foot. The Allies were advancing on Germany from the west and the Soviets from the east. The fall of the Third Reich was inevitable. As the official histories note, The prevailing mood in February of 1945 was to strain every nerve for a quick end to the war in Europe, to release forces to join in the mounting successes in the Pacific against Japan. To that end, Bomber Command targeted German road and rail networks, communication facilities, war factories, industrial centres and oil refineries. The desperate and depleted Germans turned to using benzol plants as an alternative supply of motor fuel. And so it was, Flight Lieutenant Ordell and his crew were given their next orders: to bomb the benzol works in Bottrop, a city in west-central Germany, close to the Dutch border. Ladies and gentlemen, 80 years ago today, on the 3rd of February, the brave lads undertook that mission. Every mission was a dance with death. Of all the Allied airmen who served in Bomber Command, 44% were killed. Indeed, of the Australians who served, more than 1 in 3 were killed. Every bomber crewman on every mission, in every tour of duty, prayed that contingency would never come to pass. But it was an eventuality that every bomber crewman on every mission, in every tour of duty, had to prepare for that mentally. Flight Lieutenant Ordell and his crew took off from the east coast of England at about 4 p.m. It's likely the crew reached their target in Germany at about 7:30 p.m. and dropped their bombs. Shortly afterward, having turned towards home, their Lancaster was suddenly hit, possibly by German anti-aircraft gun flak, possibly by an enemy fighter piloted by the Iron Cross Heinz Rocker. It did not matter, for the knockout blow had been delivered. The Lancaster bomber burst into flames and began to dive. Tail gunner James Harper was able to bail out in the chaos. He parachuted into a field, hid in a barn, was caught by German soldiers and spent the rest of the period of war in prison before he was liberated by the Americans. James, as it turned out, was the lucky one. The rest of his mates did not survive the crash. Robin Ordell and his band of flying brothers were proud to be men of the Air Force, and yet with the crew's average age being just 22, they really were just boys. Their service and sacrifice are a testament of youth, maturity and courage in extremis, and today we commemorate them. We honour them among the more than 4,000 Australians killed while serving in Bomber Command, Australians who helped win the war. Victory in Europe came on the 8th of May 1945, and victory in the Pacific came 99 days later on the 15th of August 1945. And in 2025, we mark 80 years since the end of the most catastrophic war in human history. At each last post ceremony, gratitude fills our hearts for those Australians who fought evil and fell for causes good and just. But our remembrance of them isn't only about our gratitude for them. Our remembrance of them reminds us of our own need for resolve. Because today tyrants torment, because today authoritarian regimes amass arms and assert and aggress, because today the peace our forebears helped secure is being pushed towards the precipice. From this National War Memorial, our most consecrated cenotaph, the souls we commemorate reach out to us. They experience the horror of war to defeat evil and restore peace, whereas we must preserve peace by deterring evil to prevent catastrophic war. In that duty, may we never waver in effort, energy and endeavour, spurred on by the service, the sacrifice and souls of those who were commemorated, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Dutton. Ladies and gentlemen, for those that are able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem.
Ho, ho, party! Hey, hey, hey! Ho, ho, party! Present arms!
Australia.
For those who are able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. The family of Flying Officer Charles Edward Suffren. The Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Senator the Honourable Sue Lyons, President of the Senate, and the Honourable Milton Dick, Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Honourable Richard Marles, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Andrew Hastie, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Matt Keogh, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, and the Honourable Barnaby Joyce, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. the Honourable Pat Conroy, Minister for Defence Industry and Capability Delivery, and Mr Gavin Pearce, representing the Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence. Air Marshal Robert Chipman, representing the Chief of the Defence Force, and Major General Greg Mellick, the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia. The Honourable Kim Beazley, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. And the final wreaths this evening will be laid by visitors to the memorial.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Flying Officer Charles Edward Suffren. Charles Suffren was born on the 20th of January 1922 in Ballarat, Victoria. Known to his family and friends as Ted, he was the youngest of 4 children, born to Charles Suffren, a salesman, and his wife Euphemia. Ted was educated at Ballarat Grammar School. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, he was working as a clerk for the National Bank of Australia. Ted Suffren enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force on the 20th of July 1941. After basic flight training, he took courses in navigation, bombing and aerial gunnery. In June 1942, Suffren was awarded his Air Observer's Badge, embarked for active service overseas. He arrived in England on the 18th of November 1942. After a stint at the Royal Air Force Station in Bournemouth, he was allocated to Number 10 Observer Advanced Flying Unit and then to Number 27 Operational Training Unit at RAF Litchfield before joining Number 1667 Heavy Conversion Unit. There, Suffren and his comrades spent 2 months training in 4-engine heavy bombers such as the Avro Lancaster. In mid-September 1943, Suffren joined his first operational unit, Number 460 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. Based out of RAF Binbrook, the squadron operated with Lancasters as part of one group bomber command. The squadron was chiefly involved in bombing offences and missions in support of Allied group ground operations, including about 30 with Suffren. His final mission took place on the 9th of April 1944. Taking off from Binbrook in Lancaster ME663, his crew made their way towards the Baltic coast of German-occupied Poland. After laying in mines in Danzig Bay, they turned back for England. At about 23,000 feet over Denmark, ME663 was attacked by several German night fighters and badly damaged. The pilot performed an evasive manoeuvre, diving to 18,000 feet and ordering the crew to bail out. With both wings on fire, the Lancaster dived out of control to just 6,000 feet. One crew member bailed out successfully, but Ted Saffron became stuck while trying to help a wounded comrade. As Lancaster ME663 hurtled towards the ground, Suffren was thrown from the aircraft just before the crash. Suffren lay outside in agony for hours. Certain he would not survive, he scrawled a last message on his water pouch. Attacked at 0340 on the 10th of April 1944, thrown out of aircraft. Have broken back, given my love to my family, Ted. Over an hour later, still alive, Suffren scrawled another message. 0510, pain unbearable. He was found several hours later by Danish people who took him to the hospital in the town of Horsens. He had suffered a vertebral fracture, as well as a broken leg and serious abdominal wounds. After he'd received only minor treatment, German officials demanded Suffren be moved to Germany. Doctors protested that Suffren was too ill to be moved, but to no avail. He was taken to the Lutworth Hospital in Frankfurt. A Danish newspaper reported that he was taken away. Patients and nurses who tried to place flowers in the flyer's hands were brutally swept aside by the Germans. Nevertheless, the Australian airmen could be seen clutching a bunch of red and white carnations. While he was in the Frankfurt Hospital, Suffren was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for skill and fortitude shown in operations against the enemy. In January 1945, he was moved to another hospital at the Hohe Mark. There he died of his wounds on the 16th of February 1945. A fellow prisoner wrote to Suffren's family, "I was immediately attracted to Ted's fine spirit and his philosophical attitude to his wounds and slow progress. Had he lived, he undoubtedly would have been paralysed from the hips down and bedridden for life. The German doctors and nurses fought hard for him. I can assure you that they did as much for him as they would have for one of their own lads. When there was definitely no hope of his recovery, I persuaded the doctors to let him move to this pleasant haven of rest with sunshine, trees and blue sky, and 70 British and American patients with a number of Australian Air Force boys who used to chat to him about home. His spirit to the last was of the finest, and all who came in contact with him, Germans, Americans and British alike, all had the greatest respect for his courage and the tremendous fight for life he put up. Today, Ted Saffron lies at the Dünbach War Cemetery in Germany. His headstone bears the words chosen by his family. His duty nobly done, forever we will remember. Flying Officer Ted Saffron was 23 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Flying Officer Charles Edward Suffren, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and the hope of a better world.
If able, please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Ho, party, present, arms. Ho, party, soldier, arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Ho, party, outwards, turn. Ho, party, quick march. Down, turn.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.